There is something strange happening to the sneaker industry. A shoe that looks like it belongs in a $150 store window can now appear on your phone for a few dollars. Not in a factory catalog, not behind a distributor, not after crossing through a chain of American retailers. The factory itself can now find the customer. And that changes the question. Because for decades, we were taught to think of a sneaker as a product of a brand. Nike designed it. An athlete wore it. A retailer sold it. You paid for it. But somewhere along that journey, there was another player that most consumers never saw. The factory. And the factory has been getting very, very good at making sneakers. In Fujian, China, entire cities have been built around footwear production. Fujian alone has thousands of footwear companies and an annual production capacity measured in the billions of pairs. Xinjiang has become such a dominant sports shoe manufacturing cluster that Chinese state media has described it as producing roughly 1 in every 5 pairs of sports shoes globally. For decades, this was exactly what Western sneaker companies wanted. They didn't need to own the factories. They just needed the factories to make the shoes. But now the system has developed an uncomfortable problem. The people who learned how to make the product have also learned how to reach the customer. And suddenly, the question isn't, why can China make a $5 shoe? The question is, what happens when the factory no longer needs the brand to sell it? To understand why a $5 shoe is so disruptive, we first have to understand why a normal sneaker costs $100, $150, or sometimes much more, because the obvious explanation is wrong. Nike isn't buying a $20 shoe and simply putting a $150 price tag on it. The economics are much more complicated. Imagine a sneaker leaving a factory in Asia. There is foam, rubber, mesh, thread, adhesive, packaging, labor, factory overhead. Then comes transportation, import costs, warehousing, distribution, the brand's employees, design teams, research, athlete contracts, advertising, retail, and, eventually, the store where you see the shoe. The physical object may represent only one part of that final price. Industry cost breakdowns have historically estimated factory-level costs for many mainstream sneakers in the high teens to high 20s, depending on the shoe and manufacturing arrangement. The exact number varies, and Nike does not publish a cost sheet for every individual sneaker. But even that uncertainty reveals something important. The sneaker you buy is not just foam and rubber, you're buying an entire system, and Nike spends billions maintaining that system. In fiscal 2026, Nike reported roughly $4.75 billion in demand creation, spending that includes advertising, promotion, digital marketing, and sports marketing. So when you look at a $150 sneaker, the missing money isn't simply disappearing into a corporate vault. It is being distributed across an enormous machine designed to turn a manufactured object into something people actually want. That's the part the $5 shoe threatens. Not necessarily the shoe itself, the machine around it. And this is where it's easy to make the mistake of portraying the old sneaker industry as stupid. It wasn't. The system was brilliant. Nike didn't have to build factories across the world. It could focus its capital on design, product development, marketing, and distribution, while independent manufacturers handled much of the physical production. That was incredibly efficient, and it created scale. A global sports brand could launch one product and place it into thousands of stores. A famous athlete could wear it. Millions of people could see it. Retailers could stock it. The consumer could walk into a store, try it on, and leave with it the same day. The factory was invisible, and that invisibility was part of the business model. The customer didn't need to know who stitched the upper. They needed to know who the shoe belonged to. Nike, Adidas, Jordan. That logo was the interface between the factory and the consumer. For decades, it worked, but there was a hidden trade. The brands kept the customer. The factories kept learning. Go to Fujian. The story doesn't look like a sneaker advertisement. It looks like an industrial ecosystem. Factories sit beside factories. Material suppliers sit close to manufacturers. Tooling companies make molds. Chemical suppliers make compounds. Workers move between companies, carrying years of specialized knowledge. One factory may make the upper, another supplies foam, another makes the outsole, another creates the molds, another provides machinery. The distances between these businesses can be tiny, and when thousands of companies doing related things occupy the same region for decades, something happens that doesn't show up on a balance sheet. Knowledge starts moving faster. That is how industrial clusters become powerful. You don't just get cheaper labor, you get faster problem solving. If one factory discovers a better material, the supplier network can adapt. If another improves a mold, other manufacturers can learn from it. If a brand demands a new construction method, the ecosystem develops the capability to produce it. This is one reason China's footwear story is not really a story about cheap labor anymore. The cheap labor story explains part of the past. It doesn't fully explain the sophistication of the present, and this industrial base wasn't created overnight. Western brands helped build the foundations decades ago by moving large portions of footwear manufacturing into Asian supply chains. As production shifted again toward countries such as Vietnam and Indonesia, specialized manufacturing knowledge and supplier networks remained deeply rooted in Chinese industrial clusters. The factories had learned, and eventually they learned enough to build their own products. Then came one of the strangest chapters in the entire story. Putian became notorious for counterfeit sneakers. For years, the region developed a huge underground market for replicas. From the outside, that looked like a simple story. Western brand makes expensive shoe. Chinese factory copies it. Consumer buys fake. End of story. But underneath that was something more complicated. To make a convincing sneaker, you need molds, materials, construction knowledge, color matching, sole geometry, foam, stitching, finishing, quality control, and people who know how all of those pieces fit together. The replica economy wasn't just copying logos, it was accumulating manufacturing knowledge, and eventually, some of that knowledge could be applied without the logo. That's an important transition, because a counterfeit depends on the original brand. A factory direct product doesn't. It can say, forget the logo, here's the foam, here's the shape, here's the comfort, here's the price. And suddenly the consumer has a different way to evaluate a sneaker. Not, who wears this, but what is actually inside it. This is where the story gets even more interesting, because manufacturing knowledge alone isn't enough. A factory needs technology, and some of the most important advances in modern footwear are buried inside a part of the shoe most consumers never see: the midsole. That soft layer between your foot and the ground. For decades, EVA foam was one of the workhorses of athletic footwear. It was cheap, light, easy to mold, reliable, and good enough for millions of people. But modern performance shoes began pushing much further. Materials like PEBA, TPU, and TPE can be engineered into highly responsive foams. One important process is called supercritical foaming. The basic idea is surprisingly simple. You take a polymer, you introduce gas under high pressure, and instead of creating a random mass of bubbles, you control the formation of microscopic cells throughout the material. The result can be an extremely lightweight foam with high rebound. That technology helped power the new generation of premium running shoes. And here's the uncomfortable part for the old sneaker hierarchy. The knowledge didn't remain locked inside one American brand. The machinery didn't remain locked inside one American brand. The chemistry didn't remain locked inside one American brand. Manufacturing capability spread. Chinese material and footwear suppliers became increasingly capable of producing advanced foams and high-performance components. That doesn't mean every $5 shoe suddenly contains the same technology as a $250 racing shoe. It doesn't, but it means something important has changed. The physical technology of a premium sneaker is becoming less mysterious. Then the internet changed the equation again. For most of the sneaker industry's history, factories didn't need to market directly to consumers. They didn't know the consumer. They knew the brand. Nike would say, make 100,000 pairs. The factory made them. Nike handled everything downstream. But platforms like TikTok, Douyin, Temu, AliExpress, and other cross-border marketplaces created a new possibility. The factory could now see consumer demand directly. Which shoe gets clicks? Which color sells? Which price gets attention? Which design gets returned? Which product suddenly goes viral? Instead of producing millions of pairs first and hoping consumers buy them later, factories could increasingly experiment with smaller batches and react to online demand. That's the idea behind factory-to-consumer and consumer-to-manufacturing models. The internet didn't just create another store. It created a feedback loop: customer, algorithm, factory, product, customer. And suddenly, the old chain had competition. Then the videos started spreading. Factory owners, manufacturers, sellers, influencers, people showing shoes directly from Chinese supply chains. Some were advertising footwear for only a few dollars. The visual was powerful. A shoe that looked like something you would normally see in a shopping mall sitting on a factory table. No giant advertising campaign, no celebrity, no elaborate retail display, just the product and a price: $5. Now, we have to be careful here. A viral $5 factory offer does not prove that every $150 performance sneaker costs $5 to make. It doesn't prove that every cheap shoe is equal in quality. And it certainly doesn't prove that Nike is simply charging you $105 for a shoe that costs $5. But that isn't why the videos mattered. They made something visible that had been hidden for decades. The factory was much closer to the final product than consumers realized. And once people saw that, they started asking questions. A collaboration can represent a musician, an athlete, a city, a subculture. A sneaker can be a status symbol. It can be nostalgia. It can be identity. That is the part the factory direct model struggles to replace. Because you can manufacture the shoe, you cannot manufacture Michael Jordan's cultural history, at least not easily. And this is why the $5 shoe is not automatically going to kill Nike. The real threat is narrower. It threatens the idea that physical manufacturing itself justifies a huge distance between the factory and the consumer. And this disruption arrived at an awkward moment for Nike. Nike had already been fighting its own internal strategic battle. Under CEO John Donahoe, the company aggressively pursued its consumer direct acceleration strategy, putting greater emphasis on its own digital channels and reducing dependence on parts of the traditional wholesale network. The strategy made sense. Why give another retailer part of the economics if Nike can sell directly? But retail has something an app doesn't: physical presence, discovery, try-on, human interaction, and, importantly, shelf space. Meanwhile, the sneaker market was changing. Consumers were looking beyond the traditional giants: Hoka, On, new performance-focused brands, new silhouettes, new running technologies. Nike's old icons remained incredibly powerful, but nostalgia can only carry a product so far. Eventually, consumers want something new. In 2024, Nike brought back Elliott Hill, a longtime company veteran who had spent more than 3 decades inside Nike. The message was bigger than one CEO change. Nike was trying to reconnect with the product, the athlete, and the wholesale ecosystem that had helped build the company in the first place. And that tells us something. The world's most powerful sneaker brand wasn't just fighting Chinese factories. It was fighting the difficulty of staying innovative inside a business model that had become extremely good at selling what already worked. But now we have to confront the obvious objection. If these factories are so capable, why should anyone pay $150? Because a shoe isn't just a manufacturing specification. A premium performance shoe can involve years of product development, biomechanical research, testing, athlete feedback, multiple prototypes, fit development, durability testing, quality control systems, regulatory compliance, and the consequences of getting those things wrong can literally follow you every time you run. A $5 shoe might be perfectly fine for walking around a city. It might be terrible for someone running 50 kilometers a week, and there is a huge difference between this shoe looks similar And this shoe performs identically under controlled testing. That distinction matters. So the real story isn't China makes the same sneaker for $5. The stronger story is China has pushed the cost of sophisticated footwear manufacturing far below the prices consumers are accustomed to seeing at retail, and that puts pressure on everyone. There is another limitation. Brand. A factory can manufacture a fantastic shoe, but how does it convince millions of people that the shoe matters? Nike spent decades answering that question. It built athletes, stories, communities, retail relationships, cultural moments. A factory direct seller can remove 5 layers of distribution overnight. It cannot create 50 years of cultural memory overnight. That's why the future probably isn't Chinese factories replace every Western sneaker brand. It's more complicated. The manufacturing layer may become increasingly commoditized, but brand, design, performance, credibility, and community may become even more valuable. The industry could split. Basic footwear becomes cheaper. High-performance footwear competes on engineering. Luxury sneakers compete on scarcity and culture. And brands increasingly have to justify what exists between the factory and the consumer. There's another force pushing in the opposite direction: governments. The factory direct model benefited enormously from low-value cross-border shipping rules. The United States raised its de minimis threshold from $200 to $800 in 2016, making it much easier for low-value parcels to enter without normal duty treatment. That became a major part of the growth story behind cross-border e-commerce. But the environment changed. The United States ended duty-free de minimis treatment for covered China and Hong Kong shipments in 2025, and later moved to suspend the exemption more broadly. So the factory isn't operating in a vacuum. The closer the factory gets to the American consumer, the more governments can see it. And that creates a completely different battle. The technology says, remove the middleman. Trade policy says, not so fast. And this is where the sneaker story becomes much bigger than sneakers, because footwear is just an unusually visible example of a much broader shift. For decades, Western companies controlled the customer relationship, while Asian manufacturers controlled physical production. That division created enormous companies, but digital commerce is beginning to reconnect those two sides. The factory can access demand. The platform can access the factory. The algorithm can decide what gets produced, and the consumer can compare products without ever entering a store. This doesn't mean the brand disappears. It means the brand has to earn its position. Because when a consumer can see 10 shoes on a screen and compare price, materials, foam, weight, reviews, delivery, and design, the logo is no longer the only information available. That is a profound change. There's one final development that makes the story even more interesting. China's sportswear industry isn't satisfied with being the world's factory. Companies such as Anta have spent years building domestic brands and moving into global sportswear. Anta became the largest shareholder in Amer Sports, the group behind brands including Arc'teryx, Salomon, and Wilson. That's important because it represents a completely different stage of the industrial journey. First, make the product, then improve the product, then build the brand, then own the brand. That is the journey from OEM to global sportswear company. And if that continues, the old stereotype of China as simply the place where Western brands manufacture cheap products becomes increasingly outdated. The competition is no longer just over who can manufacture the sneaker. It is over who controls the entire value chain. So where does this leave the sneaker industry? There are at least 3 possibilities. Scenario 1, the factory wins. Factory direct commerce becomes normalized. Basic sneakers become cheaper. Consumers stop paying huge premiums for ordinary lifestyle shoes. Western brands retreat toward premium performance, luxury, and cultural storytelling. The sneaker becomes more like consumer electronics. You pay for specifications rather than the logo. Scenario 2, governments win. Trade barriers increase. De minimis disappears. Compliance costs rise. Factory direct prices increase. Chinese manufacturers establish warehouses closer to Western consumers. The $5 shoe becomes a $20 or $30 shoe, still cheap, but no longer revolutionary. Scenario 3. The brands adapt. Nike, Adidas, and others invest heavily in actual product innovation. They use their manufacturing relationships as an advantage rather than hiding behind them. They build better shoes, better testing, better materials, better distribution, and consumers decide that the premium is worth paying. That may be the most realistic outcome because industries rarely disappear in one dramatic moment. They adapt. Remember the $5 shoe? At the beginning, it looks like the scandal, a sneaker that costs a few dollars sitting next to one that costs $150. It seems obvious. Someone must be getting ripped off. But after following the shoe backward from the store, to the retailer, to the brand, to the logistics network, to the factory, to the industrial city, the story looks different. The $150 price isn't simply the cost of rubber and foam, and the $5 price isn't proof that every premium sneaker is a scam. The real revelation is somewhere in between. For 40 years, Western brands built an incredibly efficient system by separating themselves from physical manufacturing. They kept the brand, the athletes, the marketing, the customer, and they outsourced the factories. But the factories kept learning. They learned how to make the materials. They learned the machinery. They learned the tooling. They learned the products. And now, through the internet, they're learning the customer. That's why the $5 shoe matters, not because it is necessarily the best shoe, not because every $150 sneaker is overpriced, and not because China has somehow won the sneaker industry. It matters because it exposes the distance between making something and selling something. For decades, that distance was where some of the world's most powerful brands lived. Now the factory is trying to cross it, and if it succeeds, the biggest change won't be that sneakers become cheaper. It will be that consumers start asking a question they rarely asked before. What exactly am I paying for? Because maybe the $5 shoe didn't destroy the sneaker industry. Maybe it just destroyed the illusion that the factory had to stay invisible. If you had to choose today, would you pay $150 for the brand or $15 for the factory?